back to the Big 12.
let's get people ready. College football is a world going through some major changes with its divisions. Age-old rivalries gone. Geography be damned. This is a grab for large market schools and television deals. The realignment is akin to Market Watch's mergers and acquisition segments. Universities that go from FCS or what was Division 2 to Division 1 get a huge bump in enrollment. Even though at some of these schools, sports is a loss leader, some of the smaller ones. We're going to get in the history of all this moving around, where it started, where it's going, and what does it all mean in the long run. Mac, can you give us kind of a brief history on realignment? I guess maybe Penn State. You want to start with Penn State?
No, we're going to go back to 71, my friend. 1971 was when the first big realignment kind of thing dropped, and that was South Carolina leaving the ACC to go to the SEC. Now, this was the first big school to kind of leave their conference. There was a lot of moving and shaking in the 20s and 30s, right? Because, what we know is the SEC started in 26. You had your kind of flagship schools, but there was a lot of in and out. People forget Tulane, founding member of the SEC. Okay.
Well, it makes sense geographically. It makes sense geographically because Tulane is in Louisiana.
Exactly. Just like the University of Chicago, founding member of the Big Ten. I know a lot of people are like, they actually have sports teams. Not anymore.
Not anymore. Northwestern took that up.
Yeah. So there was a lot of moving and shaking until they kind of settled on the teams that we would in the 70s come to know and love as our regional conferences. So the ACC kind of had the coast locked down from Virginia south. You had the SEC, which I'm going to go ahead and maybe drop another truth bomb or knowledge bomb on you guys. The ACC and the SEC used to be one conference until the 1950s, right? And then the teams that became the Southeastern Conference were pretty pissy at the East Coast teams, so they split off and formed the SEC, right? But they kind of settled, right? So you had the ACC on the East Coast, you had the SEC kind of in our deep South, what we would call the deep South. The Big Ten was the big Midwestern league, and then out west, or in Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, you had the Southwest Conference.
Oof, yes.
Which then would become the Big Eight later on. And then you had for teams even further west, you had what has actually made a comeback in the Western Athletic Conference and the Pac-8. But in 1971, South Carolina left because they felt like the ACC was far too centered on what they called the Tobacco Road schools, which is Duke, Carolina, NC State, and Wake Forest. And they were, they felt like they were getting a short shrift. But keep in mind, at this point, South Carolina was not. They're not. I mean, to this, what you would call a really great athletic program. They have fits and starts every so often, but for the most part, they're a middling program, and they have been since the 70s, right?
Well, you have a private university on the other side of the state in Clemson.
Well, yes. On top, I mean, even then, you have to understand. Clemson was a doormat, with the exception of a year or two in the 80s, until Dabo Swinney took over that job. I mean, he is a master salesman. I wouldn't say he's a great X's and O's coach, but if there's a Clemson fan in chat, go ahead.
He's got a ring, brother.
Yeah, I know. But see,
I was there.
That's the great thing about being a college coach. You do not have to be a good X's and O's guy. You have to be a good CEO. That's what you got to be, right? And Dabo is probably easily top 3 in the country right now, as far as being able to manage a program like
that. I like the way that you put that, the CEO, because that's also the way I kind of try to explain music production in the kind of Fortis sense of what it was in the early days of rock and roll. All those Phil Spectors and all these people, even Rick Rubin to a certain degree. He doesn't know how to play anything. He doesn't know any knobs on the board.
I mean, Jason, who's the big dude that was out west around LA? We're talking early to mid 80s when you had the really young grunge scene moving down to LA to kind of get more scenery, like on
Ross
first
Robinson?
tours. Maybe that was
He did a lot of the
him.
new metal stuff. Most of those
Um,
people were in Washington or Chicago.
when I read Everybody Loves Our Town, there was just one guy that was centered in LA that worked with a lot of these bands, but he controlled all the ticket sales. That's where he got people. Like, he was a promoter. And
Bill Graham?
Yes, that's him. That's him. That's him.
Yeah, like,
I mean,
that's you kind of got to look at coaches as kind of project managers more so than maybe CEO is a better term of these really large sports programs. I think project manager is better. I think the athletic director is probably more of a CEO. So when we look at these people and think that they're X's and O's guys, and that's why they got this job, to Mac's point, I do think it's about selling yourself and being able to get a situation like working at a school like Clemson and being able to sell the boosters and being able to sell students, because a lot of these kids that go to these schools aren't from the area at all, which is another thing we're going to talk about, which I think is really
yeah. Which before I even go on, like, we have this regional breakdown, and like, if you guys can just kind of picture the United States, you're like, Mac, there is no big football conference on the East Coast, north of Virginia, and that's because nobody wanted to do it. Joe Paterno, from the time he took over at Penn State until the time they joined the Big Ten, was dying to form an East Coast football conference, right? But what you have to understand is the East Coast, I mean, Paterno coached at Penn State, right? Like, that's not even what I would call the East Coast. Not even, like, Happy Valley isn't.
Like, it's not even near Philly.
Yeah, like,
yeah,
right. But the East Coast, we'll say New England down through like Delaware into Maryland. That's not a football hotbed as far as support for the college team, right? Now they put out some great high school players that leave their home and go to other places to go to school. So that's just how it was. But Paterno was dying like fighting like hell to start an East Coast league. It just never took off. So what you have by the late 70s is a large number of independents on the East Coast, right? Until you hit Virginia. Okay. And then you have a few independents, teams like Penn State, Pennsylvania is still Midwest, no matter what anybody wants to really give me shit. Okay. It's Midwest.
As a true man from Ohio.
Yeah. Right. Listen, I can only hate within my region, and I hate Pennsylvania and I hate Michigan. So it has to be Midwest. Right. And then as you headed further west, you had independent teams, right? So in 78, this is where you see the Pac, what used to be called the Pacific Coast Conference, become the Pac-8. And that's when Arizona and Arizona State both made a decision to join the PCC, and it became the Pac-8. Now, see, this is what I think is hilarious is the Rose Bowl's been played continuously almost since the mid 1900s, right? But people forget, like, until the formation of conferences and like radio deals in the 60s, it was heavily favored to USC, UCLA, the Southern California schools and the PCC. It wasn't a Pac-12 thing, right? Like, the PCC morphed into what we know as the Pac-12 now, but like, there were a lot of Pacific Coast schools that got in to the Rose Bowl because of the ridiculousness of how they place teams. Everybody has to realize, like, the whole Pac-12 Big Ten thing didn't start until the early 80s, right? That's when it became a conference only thing. Before that, it was kind of more of a gentleman's handshake agreement. It's going to be the Big Ten champ and the PCC, then the Pac-8, and the Pac-10, Pac-12 champ, right? So, like, it wasn't like all these bowl alliances that we have now wasn't a thing until the early 80s, right? But in 78, Arizona and Arizona State joined what would become the Pac-8. They were in the WAC, and everybody has to understand the WAC was the power conference out west. It wasn't the Pacific Coast Conference. Pacific Coast Conference was 6 teams. I think 3 of them were private.
They were called the 6-pack for a while before they were the Pac-8.
Yeah.
And USC kind of had some ups and downs, but Arizona and Arizona State were big time schools in the WAC. BYU was in the WAC originally, wasn't they?
Yes, absolutely. They were. They represented the WAC when they won the national championship in '84 when Jim McMahon was doing.
Jim McMahon was quarterback. And who was quarterback before Jim McMahon? The Raiders' Mark Wilson.
Can we also bring up the fact that how the fuck did Jim McMahon get into BYU?
Because isn't he from LA?
Dude, yeah, but like that guy in high school, goddamn well had more coke in his system and booze in his system. Right? like when he got to Salt Lake City, how did he get to campus for visits? And like some LDS dude wasn't like, "Oh my God, you smell like a brewery."
Yeah.
And Jim McMahon just pulls the sunglasses lower and does that bullshit smile I did. I think it's hilarious that Jim McMahon, the guy who admitted doing coke on the sidelines as the quarterback for the Chicago Bears, the guy who admitted to openly taking steroids because of all the lower body injuries he started to receive, like when he was the backup in Green Bay and Cleveland in the early 90s, right? The guy who did all that, he was clean enough to get into BYU. Okay, but
I refuse to believe that Jim McMahon was not high out of his mind.
Yeah. Okay, so in '83, and I know we're kind of we're spread out at this point, everybody, and I understand, but Georgia Tech left the SEC to go to the ACC. One of the big selling points for them to turn was the fact that they were independent for a bit. Mm-hmm. They felt they really needed to get back into a conference, and they wanted an easier way to get in there. So they're like, ACC, let's go. And in '91 under Bobby Ross, ended up winning a national title. But they haven't really done much since, honestly, since Paul Johnson left, since he was fired. But here's the big one. This is where we start getting into more recent stuff. In 1991, the Big East, which was a basketball conference. Like that's the Georgetown, that's, the St. John's, these are the power Catholic schools.
All the Saint schools, yeah.
Yes.
Villanova.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right? Big East is like, we have to get in on this football shit, right? So immediately, what do? They decide that they're going to start inviting football-only members. And the first ones they did, Miami, throw up the U, right? Mm-hmm. Rutgers, Temple, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, football-only members, right? Rutgers and West Virginia would end up coming on as full members in '95. And now Notre Dame became a non-football member of the Big East in 1995, right? Mm-hmm. So Notre Dame basketball isn't that bad, but you got to think late '90s going into the early 2000s, mid 2000s. This is when Notre Dame basketball kind of like snapped back and became kind of a really good school. That was a great addition to have, for that Catholic kind of majority, right? But in Miami's first season in the Big East, they won a national championship, right? Like, so instant gratification with that. But in '92, after the implosion of the Southwest Conference, which if anybody knows, the Southwest Conference was essentially the Texas schools, Oklahoma State, Arkansas, but you had SMU essentially torpedo the entire conference because Southern Methodist University, the place where Craig, what's his name?
Oh God, you're killing me because I know exactly. Eric Dickerson and Craig.
Yeah.
Yes, we're on the same team. The Pony Express backfield.
The Pony Express backfield.
Where everybody was getting paid. Where they were paying players so bad at SMU that they were using school letterhead.
Yes. Yeah. There's a great 30 for 30, and there's an outstanding book called Pony Excess, which is amazing. I couldn't put it down. Not to nerd out there, but I read all of it, right? Mm-hmm. But SMU exposes this large problem in the Southwest Conference where payers are just getting paid hand over fist with notes on university letterhead. Craig James, thank you,
Craig
Slightly
James,
Tethered.
Thank you, Slightly
Thank you.
Tethered. We couldn't think.
Yeah. But every school was breaking the rules, but SMU is the one that got caught the most egregiously. So it torpedoed the entire Southwest Conference, right? So as it's dying, right? It's dying, its dying breath. Arkansas and South Carolina, not Arkansas, South Carolina, but Arkansas joins the SEC. Excuse me, right? So Arkansas was like a kind of a tent pole team, as they say, of the Big West. So when they left, it kind of allowed a lot of the other schools to start looking around. Now, naturally, that didn't happen when the Southwest Conference cratered. It formed the Big Eight out of Nebraska, Oklahoma, Texas, and then invited a couple other Texas teams, and it left the kind of the outlying Texas teams like TCU, SMU, A&M, Houston, all scrambling for a new place to go. But in '92, we see Florida State joining the ACC. They were an independent prior to that. And originally, like, you have to think, everybody, like, the ACC is kind of a nerdy conference the way the Big Ten was before they let Nebraska in. Like, all their universities were members of the Alliance of Academic Universities, or Association of Academic Universities, right? And so you had to have that designation to get in. Well, Florida State has never had that. But the reason the ACC extended the invite was wildly successful football program, keep them out of the SEC, right? So they end up joining. '93, we see the Big Ten extend the invite finally to Penn State, and Joe Paul jumps at it because he wants to be in a conference. He wants to play for trophies. That was Joe Pa's big thing. I want trophies in the atrium where I can bring all these recruits in to see that. Look at us, man. We are gonna look at all we've won. As an independent, are you doing any of that? Fuck no. You're not getting trophies, right? So it was kind of a shot across the bow for the rest of kind of the Midwest, because nobody thought the Big Ten would be the one to expand. The Big Ten was full of a lot of like conservative, university presidents, a lot of conservative states. And let's face it, at this time, your state legislature had a lot to say for your flagship state university, right? Kind of like what old Gavin Newsom tried to do in UCLA. We're trying to get out. The governor was like, whoa, wait a minute. And the California legislature was like, whoa, wait a minute. And the university presidents were all like, hey, we voted for it, so fuck off, we're leaving. The checks are bigger, in the Big Ten, right?
And it's not like we're leaving the location.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're just leaving this conference.
So '96, this is when the Big Eight forms, and that we eventually spin off into the Big 12, right? Now, '99, I don't know if everybody knows this, the WAC, the Western Athletic Conference, was at 16 teams. The first conference to ever hit 16. And what they played as far as a conference schedule is they played quadrants. So 4 teams would be put in a quadrant, and they all played each other. And then they played 4 other conference games, okay? And then 4 other non-conference games. And then they got an extra game if they flew to Hawaii to play Hawaii, right? So, they were one of the first conferences to have a conference championship game. They had divisions. Like, it was, it was nuts, right? Well, the Mountain West split off from the WAC, okay? And this led to the death of the WAC as a football sponsoring conference, which it came back 2 years ago in the FCS, which is what we would call Division 1AA, or we used to. And just this past offseason, Jason, I don't know if you know this, they have one school apply for promotion to FBS, big leagues. They applied to have the whole because the NCAA doesn't know how to deal with that shit. They were just like, you got to spend another season down in FCS while we figure this out, right? So like we could easily have another 14 members jump up to FBS next season.
Jesus.
Okay. JB, no, Mountain West was not built around Unionville basketball. It was a football move. the WAC. You got to think UNLV basketball. That was 1991. That was Western Athletic all day. When the Mountain West brought UNLV with it, they were hoping that they could sustain basketball excellence, so they could say like, "Hey, we're a good football conference and we're a good basketball conference," and that didn't happen until about 2 years ago. When they could say they were good at both. But it was kind of nuts because like after the WAC split, like schools, New Mexico State and Idaho joined from the Sun Belt, which at the time was an FCS conference. There was a lot of that kind of like lower down. But this was the big one. This is when the big domino hit. And I think this is where Jason and I start getting on timeline here and start getting into like the nitty gritty of the actual discussion. 2004, UC, the ACC poached Miami, Virginia Tech from the ACC. ACC conference at the time, the conference shore up football. But Jason and I were talking earlier, and I think this is where we could actually get into this now, Jason, is we have, we said that, college football is literally a mirror for, kind of like the neoliberal economic policy.
Oh yeah.
Of the 80s and 90s, right?
Oh yeah. These are not state universities or private universities or higher education. This is moving decimal points and names on spreadsheets at the end of the day. And there's an interesting stockpiling that we're seeing, and I do appreciate Mac giving us the history because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. But that history is a long storied one. Like Mac said early on, certain schools stop becoming sports schools for various reasons. Sometimes sports are not the money maker that we think they are, especially when we talk about schools that were sports schools, maybe in the turn of the century, and even to the 50s. There was massive shifts as more bowls come to be, and television deals are also extremely important when we talk about these conference shifts.
And I mean, before you go on, Jason, remember, guys, in 1984, you had the Board of Regents of Oklahoma filed a court case against the NCAA all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sided with the Board of Regents, saying that the TV, the controlling of radio, and more importantly, the TV rights violated the Sherman and Clayton because it prohibited open competition and trade. Right? So at this point, it cracked the stranglehold, because the reason we had regional conferences was because it was most games were carried heavily on radio, right? And if I'm an Ohio State fan, they travel to Happy Valley, I can get a radio broadcast of them, and I might be able to watch them on one of the 4 networks once every couple years, because the NCAA said, well, Penn State's number 3, Ohio State's number 2, way to make money, get eyeballs on TV screen, right? This, this court case broke that open, and it said the schools who would then later on essentially give up their TV rights to the conference, which is a lot of the issues we're seeing with the Pac-12 and the ACC right now, right? But they were in charge of their own TV rights and can sign their own TV deals. And who was one of the first schools to do this? Notre Dame.
Signed that massive deal with NBC.
NBC that they've had for almost 30 years. And the fact of the matter is like, I was talking to somebody last night, and they're like, this is bullshit. Notre Dame just needs to nut up and join a conference. And I was like, contractually, they're obligated to join the ACC. If they make the decision to join a conference, because they are ACC member, except football, and they have to play 5 games against ACC's teams. So, it's as long as they can keep that 10 money that they get from NBC, they're going to stay independent. And I don't blame them. They're getting like $35 million a year just so NBC can show. Yeah.